Hello, everybody, and welcome to How to Break Down a Brand New Set, a video where I will be showing you how to break down a brand new set of Magic the Gathering cards for Limited by looking specifically at the commons and the trends that we have seen historically with those commons. If you enjoy it, hit that thumbs up button, but let's dive on into the meat because it's going to be hard to explain what the video is without actually seeing it. So, basically, sets are composed of defining cycles of cards that we see throughout sets. Pretty much every single set, we're going to see the same types of cards that fill out about half of the commons, according to my estimations based on this video. So these sorts of commons are the things you see set in, set out, the same types of effects, the same types of general roles within a set, and then their relative power levels will define how the format plays out. Now, it's relatively easy to predict what sorts of cards will be in the set because we have the classic removal spells. We have the 3/2 drops, which every color pretty much gets 3/2 drops creatures in every set. And then we have color staples, which are cards that every color is going to gain access to. So looking at classic removal spells, in white we have one enchantment removal spell. So that's like a pacifism. That's the sort of spell that you put on a creature, it then can't attack and block, and it kind of sticks around, so it can sometimes get punished later, but it's usually relatively cheap. There's also a conditional effect, which is oftentimes like a tapper creature, or a spell that only targets attackers, or a spell that only kills creatures with a certain toughness or power. White usually ends up with one of those as well. In blue, you generally end up with an enchantment removal spell as well that taps the creature, and then you usually end up with a bounce spell or a tuck spell, sometimes both. Tuck spells are the ones that put the creature back into the opponent's deck somewhere, and that's usually blue's interaction. So relatively how powerful those cards are can often determine how good blue is. And with enchantment removal getting worse and worse because of the addition of creatures kind of being able to kill enchantments or being able to punish that by having static effects, enchantment removal has been getting a little bit worse recently, and so the bounce spell or the tuck spell can really define blue as a color. Black generally gets one cheap conditional spell, so something that small that'll deal 2 damage or give -2/-2 or minus a small conditional removal spell or kill a creature with 2 power or less. And then there's one unconditional removal spell usually that's a little bit more expensive. Oftentimes that one will be sorcery speed or things like that. Black sometimes gets a third removal spell, but that's not a constant thing, so I figured I'd only list the things that they pretty much get every single set, and then there's oftentimes going to be a third one as well. In red, you're going to get one cheap burn spell, and you're going to get one expensive burn spell pretty much across the board. Every set pretty much has these two. Sometimes you'll get a burn spell that does 1 damage to a creature with some other marginal effect, and that can kind of count as removal, but it's usually more minor than being a real removal spell. And then green, you generally get one fight spell or bite spell. So a bite spell is the one where the creature doesn't receive damage from the opposing creature, and the fight spell is the one where both creatures deal damage to each other. And so green, as you can see, generally lacks in the removal department, so you have to pair it with colors that generally get removal. And so if it's a bite spell, green immediately gets a little bit of a boost, and if that is an instant speed spell, it also gets a bit of a boost because instant speed means you're less likely to get blown out by opposing removal, but green generally not thriving in the removal department. So you pretty much see those exact same removal spells every single set, and so how powerful they are relative to each other can really dictate how powerful the colors are relative to each other. Now, the 3/2 drops is another important thing that pretty much each set, every color gets good 3/2 drops, and how powerful those are is really important. And if a color is lacking in 2 drops, it's generally going to just suffer because it can't do anything in the early game, and it'll just get crushed by aggro. And aggro decks can't really develop if they don't have the good 2 drops. And so if you have more than one 2 drop that is bad, you need to be really careful about a color because you're not reliably going to be able to get a deck filled with the one good 2 drop that a color has access to, and so you need to be careful. So for example, one of the reasons that green maybe was a little bit weaker in Midnight Hunt is because a couple of its 2 drops weren't particularly good. The Wolf wasn't particularly good. The Timberland Guide wasn't particularly good. The Harvest Sentry, the 3/1, was pretty solid, but you generally didn't have the quality 2 drops. And yeah, so you just need to make sure that you have pretty solid 2 drops. And especially if you're an aggro deck, you need to be able to get that critical mass. So yeah, color staples, looking at white first. These are similar to the removal spells, the types of effects you see set in and set out. So white generally gets 2 combat tricks. It generally gets 1 mass pump spell. Usually it'll vary whether it's a common or uncommon, but they almost always get one. There's usually 1 enchantment hate spell. So white happened to have its enchantment hate spell attached to its 2 drop this time around in Midnight Hunt. So Cathar Commando was enchantment hate that was attached to a 2 drop. Sometimes it'll be an instant or sorcery that blows up an enchantment. Sometimes they also can deal with artifacts, but a lot of the time it's only enchantments. So yeah, they usually get one enchantment hate that sometimes also doubles as artifact hate, and then they usually get one expensive flyer, like a 5-mana 3/4 flyer is relatively standard for white decks to see. In as just a card you can see expect set in and set out. Blue, it's generally going to have one card draw spell. It's going to have one counter spell. Sometimes it'll have more, but usually just has one. It usually has one combat trick that's like shrinking the opponent creature. It doesn't usually like buff its own stats, but it'll like give the opponent's creature negative power, or it'll give its own creature like positive toughness or things like that. It'll usually get one cheap flyer like a 3-mana 2/2 with upside, and then one expensive flyer like a 5-mana 3/3 or with upside, or a 5-mana 4/4, or like sometimes just like a more expensive flyer as like a finishing card. Black generally has like relatively set specific things that it does. So sometimes it'll be like a sacrifice deck. Sometimes it'll be like, I mean, oftentimes it has sacrifice sub themes, but that's not like a guarantee for each set. But you can pretty much always guarantee it's going to have a discard spell, like a mind rot. It's going to have a raise that effect. It's going to have like a utility trick. And by utility trick, I mean something like a Blade Brand from Midnight Hunt, where it gives the creature Death Touch. It usually doesn't give like massive amounts of power, but it often will give something like Death Touch, or sometimes it will give like Lifelink or things like that. So it's like a combat trick that's more like utility focused. Sometimes it'll be like give the opposing creature -1/-1, or things like that. Or like give your own creature +1/+1, and the other creature -1/-1 is also a pretty standard black trick. So you're not gonna like die from nowhere by them just putting 3 pump spells onto their creatures, but it'll make combat a little bit tougher for you. And then red, gain access to 2 combat tricks typically. 1 rummage effect, be that like a tormenting voice type thing, or like a creature that can rummage. 1 threaten spell is pretty standard, and then 1 artifact hate spell is also pretty standard as well. And then green will gain access to 2 combat tricks typically. 1 ramp or fixing. Sometimes it'll have more depending on the set specifics. Usually has 1 6-drop finisher, like a Colossal Dreadmaw or a Honey Mammoth type card. And then it usually has like 1 piece of artifact / enchantment hate. Oftentimes it will also have a anti-flyers card as well, like a plummet type effect. So in addition to those cards that you kind of see in every set, you'll need to watch for like the 1-drop trend. The 1-drops are getting better and better in limited these days, and recent sets have had like pretty much like a good 1-drop for every color, or like a playable 1-drop for every color a lot of the time. And then you also need to be able to watch for value creatures, because those are often some of the best cards in an individual set, and they've been coming up more and more frequently, where it's just a creature that randomly generates a bunch of value on its own by just like entering the battlefield and drawing a card or things like that. So you need to be watchful for those. The 1-drop trend is essentially, as I said, every color getting a playable 1-mana creature can shift how the format plays out, because if a color doesn't get a good 1-mana creature, then it can kind of just immediately be a little bit weaker. In Midnight Hunt, green's 1-mana creature, the Wolf, that could get +2/+2 if you paid 2 mana, was just a little bit weaker than the 1-drops other colors got. And so that was a little bit of a ding against green. White got actually 2 playable 1-drops in Midnight Hunt, because it had the Tapper and it had the Lunarch Veteran. So those are just things to keep in mind, is that when 1-mana creatures become more viable, it becomes more important than ever to have a low curve that can affect the game early. And then value creatures, they generate card advantage, and they're often among the strongest commons, and they're more frequent. So if you are like drafting or looking at the new cards, be aware of the cards that generate value. One of the things that I fell victim to in Midnight Hunt, I still gave all of the cards that like generated value strong grades, but I was like, wow, there's so much value that it's each individual piece of value is going to be weaker because value is just everywhere. But that just turned out not to be the case, because value creatures are still just incredibly powerful. So like Organ Hoarder is just like an incredible card. Something like the 4-mana 2/2 in white that drew a card when it entered and cost less for each creature you attacked with was also very good. The Eccentric Farmer, very good value card. There's just a lot of ways to get value from your creatures, and even like the Disturbed creatures are a great example as well. They generate card advantage. They're often among the strongest commons. They just do a lot of good work. So keep in mind the creatures that generate value on their own, and they're just oftentimes some of the strongest commons. So some of the takeaways from this sort of analysis, I like going through, if you just add up like the numbers of cards like that you can see, that's like usually over half the cards. And then there are other cards that you can predict. Like you're like, well, white is probably going to get a 3-mana 3/2 with some marginal ability. And it's probably going to get a 4-mana 3/3 with some marginal ability. And green is probably going to get like a 5-mana 5/5 that has trample or something like random like that. Like you can predict other things, and it's not that hard to do. But those seem to be like, those are the categories that I generally find the most relevant. For example, as I was showing with red generally gets one artifact hate card. And in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, that was Plundering Barbarian. And Plundering Barbarian was like a very, very powerful version of the artifact hate card, which made the equipment a little bit worse. And it was definitely a relevant factor for that format, was how powerful the Plundering Barbarian was. Similarly, sometimes the artifact or enchantment hate card is in green is like actually relatively playable in the main deck, and so you need to be careful and know that your artifacts and enchantments aren't guaranteed to stick around. The relative value of your removal is important. How good are enchantment removal spells? They're generally on the decline right now, but there's always the potential for them to be good in a set, because they do have the potential to be very powerful. It's just a lot of the times modern day sets have been punishing to those. Just there's also like general trends in terms of like what colors do. So like certain archetypes come up frequently. And so yeah, let's just go to some of these. Removal and 2-drops can define a color is one of the biggest takeaways. If a color has weak 2-drops, it's really going to struggle. If it has really good removal, it's oftentimes just going to get naturally bumped up by that. But removal without 2-drops is still generally not the best recipe for success. And sometimes you can still have good removal and good 2-drops and still not be the best, just because you don't have like the value that you need, or you don't line up with the format well. But generally, if you have good removal and 2-drops, you're at least going to be a good aggro deck. So removal and 2-drops can define a color. There's a lot of precedent to fall back on. That's just something that's very, like, when you realize how similar these sets are to each other, you can kind of look back at other sets where certain factors were emphasized. You can be like, well, mana fixing is really good in this set. What is a previous set where there was also really good mana fixing? So you can go back and be like, well, in Ikoria, there was Evolving Wilds and there were dual lands and there was a bunch of green fixing. And this is a set where fixing was very good. Or you can even go back farther and be like, well, there's these certain sets that were built to be played as 3-color sets, like Khans of Tarkir. How did that affect the drafting process? So things like that. There's a lot of precedent where you can go back and look and be like, well, in this set, the 6-mana green creature gained us a bunch of life, and that made aggro decks worse. So when Honey Mammoth was good, this is what happened. Well, how is Hill Giant Herdgorger from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms going to perform? Or just things like that. So there is a lot of precedent you can look back on, and you can also find similar trends in decks themselves. So like green-white is oftentimes an auras deck, a tokens deck, or a deck that cares about putting +1/+1 counters on creatures. Those are like 3 things that green-white often does. And so you can look back to previous versions of those green-white decks, realizing that a lot of the pieces are the same, and be like, well, these were the pieces that we had last time. What are the like replacement pieces that we have in this new set, and how do those line up? And that's a way that you can kind of factor in the previous sets and the precedents as well. So yeah, that is a just sorry about that. That's just one of the ways you can use precedent. You can also be like, well, this is the way this tribal deck played out. It had these cards. These were the key payoffs. We don't really have those here, so maybe it's not going to be as good. And then finally, takeaway, finding the differences in each set is the key. This is like half the commons, but then the other half are going to be dependent on the mechanics, how those play out, how those interact with things. And when you can when you have like a baseline and then you can find the differences, you can be like, wow, this mechanic really plays well with these classic like set of cards, or the black removal spell is really weak this set, so maybe this thing will perform better. And that's just something to look for. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to help the video, remember to hit the like button, comment with your questions, subscribe for more limited content, and in the comment section down below, leave hashtag #template4success to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. That's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.